two. And I'm going to start the webinar. And Margaret, you're live.
Welcome, everyone. We will wait just a moment or two. There are still people entering the webinar, so we're going to give everyone a chance to come in and get settled, and we'll be starting in just a minute or two. Okay, I think we can go ahead and begin. So good evening and welcome to the Climate Change Risk and Resilience Forum. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the League of Women Voters of San Mateo County. I'm Margaret Lukens, President of the League of Women Voters of North and Central San Mateo County. This session is part of a series on bay and coastal flooding and fire risk mitigation in our county. This series of meetings is co-sponsored with OneShoreline, the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. We are providing Spanish translation of tonight's discussion, as well as Mandarin translation. I'm pleased to introduce Victor Hernandez, who will explain how to access the Spanish translation, and then Carissa Duan, who will explain the Mandarin translation.
Thank you, Margaret. Muy buenas noches. Les queremos dejar saber a todos ustedes que esta reunión será interpretada tanto en el español como en el mandarín. Para poder acceder al canal de audio, usted tendrá que hacer clic en el botón de interpretación, es decir, aparecerá un icono del globo o un mundo en su barra de tareas en la plataforma de Zoom. Después de eso, aparecerá un menú y entonces usted podrá seleccionar el idioma que guste. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Carissa Duan, for instructions in Mandarin.
Thank you, Victor. 大家晚上好，欢迎你们来参加今晚的会议。今天晚上我们将会有西班牙语与国语或者普通话的同传服务。那如果您需要听普通话或者国语的同传的话，请在您的 Zoom 的下方会看到有一个地球仪的标志，那请点击这个标志，选择 Mandarin 或者是 Chinese， 这是作为你的语言。好，谢谢。Thank you.
Thank you, Victor and Carissa. Please note that this meeting is being recorded. Following the presentations, there will be a question and answer session. You can ask your questions in two ways. The first is by email. Email your question to lwvncSMC.questions@gmail.com. That stands for League of Women Voters, North and Central San Mateo County. questions@gmail.com. We'll be monitoring that email account during the presentations, collecting your questions. Or you can submit your questions via the Q&A box on your screen. Simply click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. A dialog box will open and you can enter your question there. The League of Women Voters is a 101-year-old nonpartisan political organization with a mission to empower voters and defend democracy. This series of countywide community discussions on the impacts of sea level rise and wildfires is part of our mission. These discussions focus on the potential effects of climate change throughout San Mateo County and potential solutions. Tonight's forum will focus on the cities in the north of San Mateo County, the cities of Brisbane, South San Francisco, San Bruno, Millbrae, and Burlingame. We hope to inform and inspire more of our neighbors to become deeply engaged with these issues that affect us all. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to San Mateo County Supervisor and OneShoreline Board Chair, Dave Pine.
Good evening, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to join you and appreciate the League of Women Voters hosting a series of sessions on climate resiliency, particularly the focus on sea level rise and flooding. Picking up the papers, these days, of course, what's on top of mind seems to be fire. We have another crisis on our hands, a slow-moving crisis, and that's sea level rise. Sea level rise is caused by the capture of heat in the atmosphere, which causes the great enormous ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica to melt. And the heat not only causes the ice to melt, but also expands the water through thermal expansion. So it's hard to imagine how in the world the sea could rise, but the ice is melting at just an incredible rate. Scientists estimate about 1.2 trillion tons of ice a year are now melting due to the warming climate. So what does this mean for San Mateo County? It will have profound effects for San Mateo County. Of all the counties in California, San Mateo County will be the most impacted. And that's really a function of our historical development patterns and the fact that we have both the coast side, Pacific coast side, and the Bay Shore. But on the Bay Shore, when you look at north to south, we've done tremendous infill into the bay. So there's really no place for the water to go. And that puts at risk a tremendous number of assets. A few years ago, the county completed a climate vulnerability assessment. And we estimate that with 3 feet of sea level rise plus a storm event, $34 billion in property would be at risk. 380 miles of roads, over 100,000 people, 7,000 acres of wetlands. So as you can tell from these statistics, this is an enormous threat to the county. Tonight we'll focus specifically on Brisbane to Burlingame, which is primarily a bay fill, and it's highly concentrated with numerous important assets. Of course, San Francisco Airport, our hotels in Burlingame, many industrial buildings in this area, all of which are subject to sea level rise. We'll also learn tonight a little bit about a new organization called OneShoreline. OneShoreline was formed about 2 years ago now to bring all the cities in the county together to combat sea level rise kind of from a uniform front. Really with 3 goals in mind: is to work across jurisdictional lines, build expertise in one organization, and create an organization that can compete for funding at the state and federal levels. So on the one hand, we have enormous vulnerabilities and enormous threat moving closer each day. On the other hand, we're starting to take steps in creating the infrastructure needed to address those challenges. So let me now turn the mic over to my colleague, City Councilwoman Donna Colson from the city of Burlingame. Donna has served with distinction in Burlingame and also is a member of the OneShoreline Board of Directors. Donna, thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Pine. It's my great pleasure to be here this evening with all of you. I'm Donna Colson. I am the director that is responsible for the northern part of San Mateo County. And it is my great pleasure to work with all the independent councils, mayors, and others to put together a concerted and coordinated effort around tackling sea level rise so that each city is not independently remaking over and over again the same decisions and the same work. Applying for grants, for example, is an incredibly important part of the work that we're doing. Burlingame has, as Supervisor Pine mentioned, over 40% of our city budget, as an example, is tied to transit occupancy tax of hotels that are all aligned within the sea level rise area of San Mateo County and our city. So you can see that these are huge vulnerabilities that we all have to address. We also have, for example, a wastewater treatment plant, ingress and egress to Highway 101, all very important assets that the community does need to work hard and protect. And it's a difficult conversation. How do we pay for these? How do we set a unified standard so that builders and people who own property know what the expectations are and how we're going to meet sea level rise? And that is one of the wonderful things that we've been working on here in Burlingame. The OneShoreline staff has allowed us to coordinate and leverage our staff here in our city to make sure that we are able to, for example, apply for federal grants to develop a plan of how we will be addressing sea level rise and flooding in our city. So it is with great pleasure that I would like to introduce the CEO and leader of our group, OneShoreline, Len Matterman. Just a little bit of background about Mr. Matterman. We were fortunate to have him come to us in the spring of 2020, where he was appointed CEO. This is the first county-wide independent government agency in California and probably in the United States, focused on climate change and impact. Fortunately, we had the strong support early on from Congresswoman Spear and her office, and that gave us plus adding on Senator Jerry Hill and Assemblymember Mullen, who carried legislation to form this. So we were very fortunate to have a very integrated approach to getting this done. Len, from September of 2019 to 2020, he was a public policy practitioner in residence at Stanford University, Center for the American West, and with colleagues at Stanford and UC Berkeley. He was a contributing author of 2 recent books on financing and implementing large-scale climate resilience projects. Prior to joining us, we had a lot of familiarity with Mr. Matterman because he served as the executive director of the San Francisco Creek Joint Power Authority, where he led the largest completed multi-jurisdictional sea level rise protection effort in the state. He also has been a collaborator of modeling research and other work with nonprofits and the State Department, as well as other nationally recognized entities such as PBS. And during the Clinton administration, he served as a policy advisor to FEMA and has been on 2 White House task forces. Prior to his work in Washington, DC, he was the director of government affairs at UC Berkeley. So with that distinguished introduction to our wonderful CEO, Len Matterman, I will bring him on and turn the presentation over to him.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Appreciate that warm introduction, Director Colson, and thanks to everybody for joining the event today. I'm going to share my screen and walk through some more information about the agency and the work that we're doing in this part of San Mateo County. So I'll start with a share screen. And hopefully you all can see that. Let me know, somebody, if that.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so this is the 5th in our series with the League of Women Voters, and thank you to the League for championing this effort. And we have one more of these in mid-October focused on the coast side. We're looking forward to that on October 14th. As Supervisor Pine said, sea level rise is an important issue for San Francisco Bay. This graph shows that it's not a new issue per se, that the bay level, water level, has risen about 1 inch every 15 years since the turn of the last century in 1900, and a relatively kind of mainstream projection has it going from 1 inch every 15 years, what we've seen, to about 1 inch every 2 years for the rest of this century. So it's certainly something, and that's not aggressive kind of assumption. That's a mainstream assumption, and so it's certainly something that we're following closely. And at OneShoreline, we're looking at the more extreme scenarios in terms of level of protection to provide, because we don't want to have regrets about what we end up building. We want it to provide protection for a long time to come. What these various graphs show and the news reports people have seen in terms of flooding, in terms of wildfire, in terms of drought, and in terms of sea level rise, creates a lot of anxiety. And one of the things that we're trying to do is impress upon people that this is a very serious issue. All of these issues that are listed on this thermometer are very serious, but there are people working on it, and there are ways in which we can become resilient, and I'm going to talk about that. As Supervisor Pine mentioned, San Mateo County is the most vulnerable county in California. That's in terms of population, in terms of including underrepresented people, property value, the number of homes, the number of contaminated sites. We're only one of 6 counties in the United States, and the only one on the West Coast that have over 100,000 people living in an area impacted by the first few feet of sea level rise. And as you can imagine, and was mentioned by Director Colson, schools, hospitals, highways, water treatment plants, beaches, and major corporate assets. These are just some of the important assets that are vulnerable to this issue. There are 12 cities along the bay side of San Mateo County, from Brisbane down to East Palo Alto. And so it was acknowledged when the county was thinking about how to address this vulnerability, that each city couldn't do it alone, that the shorelines obviously are connected, and there are so many cities that there needed to be an entity that could help to align and connect the efforts of each city into a uniform and aggressive level of protection. There had been a flood control district since 1959 that was thought about as a potential way to do this, but it really only had purview over 10% of the county and none of the coastside. And so it didn't make sense for that long-standing flood district to be the focus of these new efforts, with this transformative challenge. So we look at creating resilience and building a holistic approach to the threats, looking at more extreme storms and sea level rise, which is kind of new for an agency, looking holistically at the geography, aligning and connecting neighboring jurisdictions, as I mentioned, and looking holistically at the objectives, not only reducing threats, but turning waterways and shorelines from liabilities into assets that are integrated communities and utilize natural solutions and private sector involvement. Our priorities were established early last year, January 1 of 2020, so we're new. But our priorities for this fiscal year, which extends through the middle of 2022, are to complete our first construction project, which is a long planned effort to address frequent flooding in one of the poorest areas of the county. And that project is now under construction and anticipated to be completed in January. We're advancing multi-jurisdictional projects. I'll mention some of that tonight. We're working with cities and developers so that private property and public infrastructure is protected. I'll talk about that. And we're looking at a long-term stable source of funding for the district. Here's a snapshot of the projects that we're involved with, either as a lead agency, the ones in blue, ranging from the Bayfront Canal in the bottom right of the picture at the intersection of Redwood City and Menlo Park, to Redwood Shores, to Burlingame and Millbrae, and a countywide flood warning system. There are other projects where our agency is a partner or a potential partner, and connecting into work that is ongoing. That includes construction in Foster City to build a levee and wall around that city for this purpose, and also work that's planned by San Francisco International Airport. We'll talk a little bit about that. In terms of our flood warning system, just to briefly mention that we're working with cities in 4 watersheds on the bay side, and we're looking at a couple watersheds on the coast side. to develop a new warning system. And also this year, we're going to begin to work with cities on emergency action plans in the Colma and San Bruno watersheds and other watersheds farther south in the county. So Brisbane to Burlingame. This is a snapshot of what the bay shoreline looked like 80 years ago in 1941. San Francisco Airport is in the middle of the picture, and it should be obvious that there was development in this area, but not right along the shoreline. And Supervisor Pine mentioned that one of the reasons our county is so vulnerable is because of the development patterns that we've enjoyed over the last 80 years. And now we just need to think about how to protect that development pattern. So here's Brisbane to Burlingame today. Obviously, it looks quite a bit different. And tonight, I'm going to touch on briefly the vulnerabilities and issues surrounding Brisbane. It'll be extremely brief. And then San Bruno. And I'll touch on the project that Donna Colson mentioned with Millbrae and Burlingame, connecting to SFO's efforts, and then our work in South San Francisco. And we'll also hear from the city manager in South San Francisco, Mike Futrell, about some of their efforts in this regard. First to Brisbane. Briefly, the city of Brisbane's vulnerability. This map on the right shows the current FEMA 100-year floodplain. And you can see San Francisco Bay is on the right, Highway 101 is labeled, and certain areas of Brisbane are in the current FEMA floodplain. And I'll be speaking at the Brisbane City Council on September 23rd on this on OneShoreline and Brisbane's vulnerability and what issues are important to Brisbane. So if that's something that's interesting to you, please join the City Council meeting on the 23rd, the evening of the 23rd. This image also now shows the initial sea level rise inundation areas. So the areas in the pink circles indicate the areas that we would focus on first, likely, in terms of addressing this issue long term. Of course, Highway 101 is the largest pink circle here, and like many areas of the county, our transportation infrastructure, some of it very critical, like Highway 101, is included in the most vulnerable assets that are at risk and ones that we're working on. And we're starting to work with Caltrans on this issue. Turning attention to San Bruno. San Bruno's Bel Air neighborhood is in the yellow circle area, just south of 380 and just west of Highway 101. This area was mapped into the FEMA flood zone in 2019, much to the disappointment of the residents of the Bel Air neighborhood. And it's a complicated situation because the pink arrows show all the different sources of water, at least according to the modelers, the folks that study hydrology, all the different sources of water that come into this part of San Bruno. The arrow in the middle that has an outline of black, it shows water emanating from San Bruno Creek. And this is the result. This is a couple of years ago, taken by a local resident in the Bel Air neighborhood. This is the result of flooding there, of the creek overtopping and water backing up in the city's storm drain system. We are taking a look at this area of San Bruno Creek first to try to address San Bruno, the Bel Air neighborhood's concerns. The image, two images on the bottom are from the 380 overpass. The image to the left is looking at San Bruno Creek, and you see houses there in the middle of the picture and off to the right. And this is the area of the creek that overtops. And the image on the right is looking north from 380, and you can see all of the maze of 380 and 101. And this makes it a complicated project because Caltrans has the right of way there. So we've started the conversation with Caltrans in terms of opening up the capacity of San Bruno Creek so it doesn't back up and overtop. But it's a complicated situation that will take multiple efforts. Now to SFO and Millbrae and Burlingame. San Francisco Airport has been working for several years on its shoreline protection project, and it's now in the early stages of environmental review. And the colleague of ours from San Francisco Airport is participating in this meeting and can answer questions specific to the airport's project. One thing you will notice, though, on this image from the airport is there's in yellow dashed lines at the bottom right and the upper left of the image are options to tie their project into adjoining work by the local cities. And if they did that, then they wouldn't be building the dashed blue line at the bottom, which is option 2, develop West Side protection. And obviously option 2, the blue line, is a very long extent, and San Francisco Airport would, I think, much prefer to tie into neighboring jurisdictions. And that makes good public policy for us to be working together in that way. So we are, and San Francisco Airport is supporting our efforts to begin a project, which we will in this fiscal year, so in the next 9 months, to begin the planning for a comprehensive shoreline protection program that ties into SFO and protects Millbrae and Burlingame. So in 2019, the end of 2019, Burlingame came out with a study of its vulnerability. And in April of 2020, Millbrae did the same. So there were 3 neighboring efforts that were all looking at their individual vulnerability, and consistent with the objectives of OneShoreline and our mission, and with the support of our board, we are advancing these independent efforts into one consistent shoreline approach that also includes the creeks that flow into the bay. So this image shows about 1.5 miles, the pink line of our first phase of this project, from Broadway / Airport Boulevard area of Burlingame on the bottom right up to SFO, and also 1.5 miles of creeks, the yellow lines, all the way up to the Caltrain and BART tracks. So that's the project footprint. And the project partners have multiple reasons to be working together. This describes them in terms of establishing our common objectives, sharing technical information, sharing environmental mitigations. It's a very important piece. Obviously, sharing costs and utilizing land rights that the cities have, that SFO has, and that the private sector has in the furtherance of this project. So next I'll turn to the issue of development and new development. There's a lot of proposed development on the Bay side. It's been heavily developed, as you know, but there's a lot of proposed redevelopment or new development. Cities evaluate development proposals all the time in terms of their compliance with various requirements. And if those developments are in the FEMA flood zone, the 100-year flood zone, most cities, including the cities in this area, require that the first floor and some infrastructure are above what's called a flood elevation, which is part of these FEMA flood maps. Not yet considered are conditions brought by climate change. And we view that as a lost opportunity for 2 reasons. One, we should be incorporating protection into the early planning of a new development. And 2, that this would allow the opportunity for the private sector to share in the costs of protecting their property, related infrastructure, and neighborhood. So it's a lost opportunity both for the developer and for the local government agency. In addition, cities update general plans or specific plans, and that presents opportunities to incorporate climate considerations into the vision of the city's future. So we're looking at future conditions, and that's a really important term, and I'll talk about that briefly now. So we're working with South San Francisco and City of Burlingame, as was mentioned, and the City of Redwood City so far on the Bay side on these efforts. Okay, so OneShoreline is working with these cities in the 3 areas: general plan and specific plan updates. The City of South San Francisco is undergoing its general planning process. I know that the city manager can speak to that after I'm done. They have 7 so-called big ideas for that, and 3 of those relate to our work. You'll notice that addressing sea level rise is one of them, transforming Colma Creek, where our agency has land assets and derives property taxes, is another. And another one is improving multimodal mobility, bike and pedestrian especially. And we're certainly interested in building that into all the projects that we look at. We're working with the City of Burlingame, as mentioned, on zoning ordinances And that includes all of the area, or almost all of the area impacted by sea level rise, as was mentioned by Donna Colson. And so we're looking at both the shoreline protection opportunities and opportunities for the first floor elevation to be a couple feet above the FEMA flood zone, so that the next time the maps aren't redone, and they were redone last in 2019, 2 years ago, and the next time they're not redone, they are redone, that the buildings won't be put back into the FEMA flood zone. And then finally, looking at development projects by specific developers. And are there opportunities to work with developers and the cities so that the projects are sited in a way that enables climate resilience? And so, for example, for a development to be right on the water's edge like this, and then try to build protection later along the shoreline, as you can see, it would probably be a difficult endeavor to build that protection in a way that maintains the livability of this unit. And we want to try to avoid that by getting involved in the planning of these developments at the earliest possible stage. Looking at Colma Creek, as mentioned before, we're looking in utilizing our assets, financial and land rights assets, working with the city and in some cases with developers to improve Colma Creek, to make it an asset to the community and not just a long-standing liability that should be walled off. And we're looking forward to that continuing activity with the city of South San Francisco and its neighbors. Finally, we have new tools at our disposal that we're developing to enable developers and the city staff and the general public to identify specific areas of the city in terms of flooding, but also in terms of other things. So, for example, this shows an area of Colma Creek in South San Francisco. You see Highway 101 coming through the image. And we can identify specific properties and what a future flood depth would be at those properties, given different scenarios of extreme storms, as well as sea level rise. We can first look at the FEMA flood zone and then look at some future conditions of where flooding would be anticipated to be, and then layer on many important issues and just layers of information so that it can help decision makers like staff leadership and city council members and our board look at how do we target our projects so that they reflect our values and objectives. So this example looks at median household income, so we can be aware of the income level of people in the flood zone. And then other examples are to look at kind of where residential land is planned for, either in the general plan or specific plans, or with specific development proposals. We can take a deep dive into areas that are planned and look at their tree cover, the amount of impervious surfaces they have, and it can just be a tool to help us understand how we want to build forward in the future. Another one is to look at existing trails so we can identify kind of some of the key gaps in relation to potential residential development, and look at land rights and help to develop project opportunities based on all of those factors together. So this is my last slide. And on the left, what you see is this whole area from Brisbane to Burlingame, and in terms of the elevation. And I wanted to just point out that the land, the elevation of the land is all the blue areas are basically at or below the daily high tide. And then as the land gets higher and you go inland, it goes from blue to green to yellow to orange. So the daily high tide in this area is about 6 feet. And the FEMA 100-year elevation is about 10 feet. And FEMA has a requirement, if you build protection, to add on 2 feet of freeboard. So that gets us to the yellow, which is 12 to 13 feet. And then 4 feet above that is our objective for our projects, so that when the FEMA maps get redone next time, or the next time, or the next time, which is probably now 30 to 40 years from now, there's no issue of these properties being put back into the flood zone, let alone no issue of of these properties getting flooded due to a big storm or a tidal surge or sea level rise, because not only will they be well above the FEMA requirements, but they'll be essentially 10 feet above today's high tide, going from 6 feet to 16 feet. So again, to summarize, regarding these future risks, our objective is to avoid, protect properties, protect people, properties, and infrastructure from the current and future risks, avoid the more challenging and costly efforts to retrofit protection later. We want to avoid that. And so, we should look at how these properties, public and private, are built, what elevation they're built to, what does the waterfront protection look like, what elevation is that built to as part of regional efforts? Can we utilize marshes both for their environmental benefit and for their flood protection benefit? We're working with a team at UC Santa Cruz to study the entire San Mateo County Bay shoreline for that purpose. And then finally, incorporating trails, and that the path to resilience will be easier with a focused effort that we're helping cities to focus, as well as less costly if we embark upon it soon. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now to Mike Futrell, the city manager of South San Francisco, and then I think we'll get back to the league and start the question and answer period. Thank you.
Well, hello, this is Mike Futrell with South San Francisco. Perhaps you could turn my camera back on. That would be awesome. There we go. Good evening. Thank you, Len. Appreciate the partnership with OneShoreline very much. It's been a terrific collaboration, and I know that will continue. Len talked a lot about the macro and what's happening up and down the coast. Mine is really more the micro of what is happening in South San Francisco and some of the things we are taking on our own initiative to address our own problem of sea level rise and coastal flooding in South San Francisco. So I'm going to share screen for a moment. Let me get that moving. And here we go. Sea level rise in South San Francisco. This is our shoreline. This is the map that was referenced earlier by Lynn and others, the county study, which shows where we are at risk of sea level rise in South San Francisco. I put in a few landmarks like San Francisco and the arrow so you can orient yourself, and SFO to the south. But you can see we have two major areas of concern. One is this large area in the south, just by SFO. That's our largest problem. Lynn talked a bit about that. Coleman Creek dumps into that area. And then we have a problem to the north. And so we have different strategies for the problems in the south and the problems in the north. In the south, which is our largest concern, we have partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with a long-term strategy of getting ourselves into the federal budget. This will be a mighty expensive endeavor, no matter what solution is selected. And the federal government is where we'd like to go. Every 2 years, they pass a Water Resources Development Act, funding billions and billions of water projects throughout the United States. It's highly competitive, but the entry point for that, for every project, is the Army Corps of Engineers. So we are in an agreement with the Corps of Engineers using Section 203 of the WRDA Act. We actually went to Washington. We've met with the Corps leadership in Washington many times. We've had amendments to the bill in Congress, making it easier for us to partner with the Corps, and here we are. We have finished the first phase, which is really the Corps requires that you have a plan on how to plan. The Corps is very bureaucratic. It is not quick. So if your idea is I need something quick, then the Corps of Engineers is not for you. But that is not our plan. We look at this as a 10, 20, 30-year endeavor to get into the federal budget for actual construction dollars. So now the Corps is into a 3-year program to actually design some sort of solution for, I'm back to this, that area in the south. That is the focus of their study. And I will assure myself tomorrow that they're working with SFO and working with Lynn appropriately in a collaborative way. But we have turned it over to them to come up with a solution. And conceivably, and hopefully that will be a solution that will help us and San Bruno as well, because San Bruno's problem originates in this same area with San Bruno Creek coming off into that same area. So our first strategy for that is to partner up with the Corps of Engineers, work with Washington, D.C., have the Corps come up with a plan, and the Corps propose that it be added into their budget in the Water Resources Development Act in a future year. Otherwise, this really is too big a problem for South San Francisco alone to handle. And I will echo the comments by Supervisor Pine and Director Colson and Lynn that no city by itself can handle these issues. Now, if we can partner with the federal government, I am all for it, and that will be great. On the northern side, we do have some partners, and we have a 2-part plan for the northern part of our city. There is a lot of biotechnology development happening on the northern side. So we sort of have the luxury of insisting that they not only prepare their own development for sea level rise, but they fix our Bayshore problem at the same time. What you see is a rendering of the Kilroy Oyster Point development, which is the largest development in the San Francisco Bay Area at the moment, a $3 billion remake of our entire waterfront in this area for life science, for tech, is well under construction, and the first phase will deliver in December with Stripe, a fintech from San Francisco moving in, as well as the biotech company Cytokinetics. So if you're lucky enough to have a wealthy developer building right on your shoreline, that gives you an opportunity to insist that they take care of the problem. They are building their buildings to a standard of the year 2100 for sea level rise, and they are fortifying our shoreline. And this is a portion of the shoreline that is under construction right now. This will open in December, but they're completely reworking the Bay Trail, building new parks. They're actually building a beach. Pretty excited to have a sandy beach on San Francisco Bay, but all of it will be built to the standards of 2100. I know they have worked very closely with regulatory agencies, BCDC and others to meet those standards, but this is all at their expense. So that was super for us. That is phase 1, which is let's get developers to pay for it when we can. And we are working on a hotel in the same area. So we are close with a hotelier who will with the same requirements, that they build their facilities to the year 2100 sea level rise, and for their portion of the shoreline, that they protect our city. That does not cover our entire shoreline and the northern part. So part 2 is a little different because we do have a portion of our shoreline which is dedicated to the public. It's open space, it's recreation, it's a marina, fishing pier. And so I don't have developers, nor do we want developers in this area. But that does change the funding mechanism on what we will do. So it will require public dollars, grants, donations. Very hopeful that the state will have a sea level rise ballot measure in coming years, a bond measure that we might tap into. Now, the area you see in the middle called the Spit, I do need a better name for that. That little peninsula is particularly at risk, and we are focused on that right now. We are investing city dollars in that right now to design a solution for sea level rise, king tides for that area, with the idea if we would start construction in just a few years. It is a $20 million or so adventure, So if we're going to spend $20 million on fixing a piece of our waterfront, we would like to deliver something worthwhile. So as part of that, this is phase one, where we lift the site. So we're working with the regulatory agencies on that to lift the site and protect it from sea level rise, king tides, and otherwise. But then phase two, we're going to build something on top of it, mainly a new commuter ferry terminal that will service all of the commuters coming to all those biotech jobs as well. And this is our vision for that particular area of our waterfront. You can see the hotel in the background. In the foreground is the raised elevated portion of the shoreline, along with a new ferry terminal. And then to the left on this slide, you can actually see the ferry coming in, and you walk into this amenity space out there. So for us, it's a dual purpose, not just protecting the shoreline, but also improving it for the public and others out on the public side of that. So it is a complex problem. And this is we kind of came together yesterday. These are our 5 principles that we're working with. First is start now. This idea of a slow moving emergency. Unfortunately, the solutions are slow moving as well. So start now and then work with urgency. We have staff working this every day. It is in our budget. I am talking to Kevin Mullins, Senator Becker. We have a lobbyist in DC. We're working this with urgency, knowing that we're not just competing with each other, we're competing with every state and every city in the nation, and not just for sea level rise. Louisiana competes for these dollars very effectively. It has nothing to do with sea level rise. So we need to get in the game. And that's why I'm super happy that OneShoreline is now with us. Prior to that, we did not really have an effective voice in San Mateo County to compete with the likes of, well, of even San Francisco, San Jose. They're very organized when it comes to getting the funding. Number 3, build alliances and partnerships. You see some of that today with OneShoreline, Corps of Engineers. We need all the help we can get. For us, number 4, focus on solutions that work for South San Francisco. There are a lot of solutions for sea level rise that just will not work in my city. We are an urban infill city. We are the industrial city. So our solutions will be different solutions, and that's fine, not a problem. But focus on what will work with us with a laser focus, and then get it done. We will get it done when we see construction happening, when we see actual protections being put in place. That may be years from now, but I'm confident if we keep pushing on that door year after year, it will eventually open. And for us, at least, we will solve that. And I've collaborated with other city managers, happy to share information for everyone. But as the city of South San Francisco, as their city manager, my first duty is to this city. So at a micro level, this is how we're proceeding forward. So again, thank you to Len. Thank you to Dave Pine for his leadership year after year. It has been a slog to get us here, but we are here and we're together on this and happy to help and answer questions as well. So thank you. And I'm not sure who's supposed to go next. So someone needs to step in and take charge. There we go. Thank you, Kathy.
Kathy, you're muted.
That's correct. I am muted. My name is Kathy Wheeler, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters in North and Central San Mateo County. We've gotten to the part of our program where we're going to open it up to questions. We've received quite a few questions already. I'm parsing the questions, and I'm going to try to divvy them up for all the members who are present to answer for specific geographies. And I urge everyone who's listening to go ahead and you can put your questions into the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom chat, or you can send me an email via the email we mentioned earlier, which is the big acronym lwvncsmc.questions@gmail. So we have a couple of general questions to Len Matterman about the OneShoreline organization, which I think would be important to answer. Len, first off, who funds the OneShoreline organization? And can we get everyone who is our expert tonight on video so that we have an actual panel? Perfect.
So Kathy, to answer the question of how OneShoreline is funded, the operations for the agency are funded by all 20 cities and San Mateo County, and they're providing funding for first 3 years. We also secure funding from property taxes in the flood zones, and I showed a map in one of my slides of the 10% of the county that are part of flood zones, and that includes Colma Creek and San Bruno Creek watersheds. So this area is substantially in a flood zone that receives property taxes. So that's how and then we secure grants for projects, and when we do construction, like we're under construction right now, as I mentioned, down in Redwood City and Menlo Park, we have a funding agreement with the relevant jurisdictions that benefit from the project. So for example, that funding agreement includes Redwood City, Menlo Park, San Mateo County, and the town of Atherton. So it depends on the project, but our core operational funding at this moment is divvied between the county and all 20 cities.
Okay, so that includes the city of Foster City. There was a specific question of whether
Yes.
Foster City is a member of the OneShoreline organization.
It does.
Okay. So here's a good general question, I think. How are grant funds for sea level rise to be distributed to the member cities for projects, and how are projects selected?
Yeah, that is a good question. And certainly others can chime in as well. When I think about projects, and OneShoreline is a new agency of a year and 8 months, and we have a staff of myself and 2 project managers and a finance manager, and so it's still a young, small organization. When I think about projects, I think about, does it already have local support? If it's a project that doesn't have local support, it doesn't make sense for us to kind of spin our wheels on something that has not been thought through and that the local community wants to be involved with. Also, does it have meaningful objectives? Is it protecting against a real threat, a real vulnerability? Does it have an objective that's achievable? Are we proposing to do something that actually can be built? That's a critical component of projects that we get involved with. And then finally, is there a clear role for OneShoreline where we add value? Not every situation would we add value to a project, but where we do, and where there's local support that asks us to become involved, and there are meaningful and achievable objectives, I think that's kind of where we would say this makes sense. We are looking largely, as I indicated in the slides, at multi-jurisdictional efforts that cross boundaries between jurisdictions, because that's where I think we add the most value.
Does anybody else want to comment on that particular question? No? Okay. There's a question about Brisbane. So it says, in your map of flood zones, there was a section of land in Brisbane and the Brisbane Baylands area. There's major development plans for this area. The question is, how are you engaging in the process to determine uses in this area? What risks have you identified for this planned development?
Well, our involvement with Brisbane is just really beginning. I know that this development has been discussed for a while, and it's really development is in the purview of the cities. Our agency doesn't have development regulatory authority in any way. It's really about working with the cities on the development that they want to have happen and how that can be protected. That's where our role comes in. And so, in regards to Brisbane and the Brisbane Baylands effort, it really would be working with the city, which we've just begun to discuss. And as I mentioned, we'll be talking about this, I'm sure, at City Council in Brisbane in about 2 weeks. It's really about kind of where the city wants to go with the development and how they view this regional agency of OneShoreline adding value to ensuring that their city is protected.
So if this particular citizen would like to have a contact, okay, to get specific questions answered, do you have any recommendations for this person?
From OneShoreline or from the city of Brisbane?
Either or.
Okay.
Or both.
At OneShoreline, probably the easiest way is info@oneshoreline.org. That's a good portal to get it kind of connected with us, and we'll get back to you by email and perhaps have a phone conversation, meeting, etc. In terms of Brisbane, I would suggest contacting the Public Works Director. He's kind of in many ways been a key contact for us, and maybe starting there. I don't know yet like what the issue is that this person would contact them about, but I would start there. If they want, they can send a question to info@OneShoreline and we'll forward it to the city.
Yeah, if you go to the city's website, usually you can find information also by asking the city clerk. Okay, there's a couple of questions about Millbrae. And this one is about the flood system at San Bruno Station, which evidently, when it overflows, ends up in a wetland that runs from San Bruno into Millbrae. And this person is saying that they flood almost every year when we get rain. Of course, we didn't get very much rain last year, so I don't know whether they actually flooded. What happens there impacts Millbrae, but no one's communicated with the Airport Park neighborhood or the Marina Vista neighborhoods. I hear there's coordination, but again, this person doesn't necessarily know, okay, exactly what the city is doing about this situation. So can someone from Millbrae make a comment about this particular situation?
Well, I'm Millie Kelly Crawford. Hi. I supported the city in preparing the storm drain master plan, and Craig Sentis is here as well. He's our acting public works director, so he may be able to answer some of the questions about ongoing communications. But when we prepared the storm drain master plan, we did look at that area and we studied the flooding situation. So we do have some information that has been shared in a couple of public meetings around sea level rise and around the storm drain master plan presentation. There is information available also on the city's website. You can find the storm drain master plan there, which does show the results and recommended actions to improve flooding. And the city's got ongoing projects throughout the city for drainage purposes, but I can't speak to exactly what is next coming with respect to Lomita Canal, other than that there has been, a couple of public meetings and information is available online.
And that would be at the city website.
That's right.
Okay. So the same person asked a question about SFO and specifically doing what SFO wants is not necessarily a benefit to Millbrae. So they're asking the question is, how do we trust that Millbrae's interests are being considered, or the best interests of Millbrae are being considered in SFO plans? And basically, I think that's the question is what is Millbrae doing actively with SFO's planning process to make sure that Millbrae is being represented fairly and it's going to be a good result for them?
Well, Craig can probably speak to the meeting we're scheduling for, is it next week, Craig, to talk to SFO with our updates, and they were going to share updates with us as well.
Correct, Millie, on the 20th.
So that partnership is ongoing. And with respect to sea level rise in particular, and I know there are different issues between local drainage and shoreline protection, but with respect to shoreline protection and sea level rise adaptation, the best way that we can protect this whole region is to present a united front to the bay and connect our projects together, with a comparable level of rise planned with adaptations that connect together and tie into one another. Otherwise, if we try to build a small flood wall or levee, the water's just going to go around the ends and come in. So the partnership with SFO is very important to Millbrae.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the previous question because I actually got a clarification on that question, and she would like to have a more detailed answer. The issue is, how is San Bruno Station plan going to impact Millbrae, not how our own Millbrae storm drainage system is going to accommodate it. So I think that to be fair, if you can, and maybe is there someone here from San Bruno? I don't think San Bruno is represented.
No, we can take a question back to San Bruno.
Okay, so I think that is the concern, is whether the San Bruno plan is taking into account the effect on Millbrae, that there's a side effect from this flooding that affects Millbrae.
Craig, are you able to speak to that at all? I'm not familiar with that issue.
Yes, that is correct. And when they send lots of water to us, stormwater runoff, it can cause a lot of problems for us because of the tules that are in the Lamina Canal, which is protected by garter snakes and red frogs. But the problem is the airport has, over the last 10 years, got a permit, and they've been working effectively, but slow, but it is getting better. And that's why we are meeting with them again next Monday to make sure the progress continues. But it is, it's not like just a hard concrete channel. It's a green infrastructure and a habitat, which is causing a little bit more effort and time to deal with.
Craig, is the meeting that you're talking about a public meeting?
No.
Okay. Will there be a report out of that meeting?
Yes.
And how can this person access that report?
They can request it from the city clerk.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. There was a one that actually, to continue with Craig and Millie, actually. So can you give a general perspective on the regional shoreline project in Millbrae and Burlingame? How do you see this work building upon the city's 2020 sea level rise adaptation assessment?
Well, it's built off of the adaptation assessment that we did in Millbrae, and we partnered with Burlingame as well. We were both funded through grants from the county. And so Kevin and I met before and collaborated as part of their technical advisory committee for their plan. So our plan was developed on the same timeline and with the same expectation of, meshing our two projects together at some point. Obviously, there are data gaps to fill. That's what Len is talking about. In next steps, there's more work to be done to really make, the project whole. But Millbrae completed this adaptation assessment and identified some shoreline solutions, and Burlingame did as well. And so, what Len and OneShoreline are doing next is to carry that forward to the next level of study and refine those designs and concepts.
Okay, thank you. This is directed at Kevin Gardner and Donna Colson from Burlingame. The regional shoreline project in Millbrae and Burlingame is a big endeavor and will require support from many different partners, including private developers along the Burlingame shoreline. Mike talked about some of the approaches that they've taken in trying to enlist the help of private industry to help fund these projects. Can you speak to how the private sector would be contributing in terms of financing and development of this project? And maybe you can first preface that with an explanation of what this project is about.
Kevin, are you, yeah, there's Kevin. Okay. I'm going to let Kevin go ahead and kick it off so he has an opportunity and I can chime in at the end.
Kevin, you're
Thank
muted.
you, Councilmember Coulson. And so there's a number of different ways that new development can respond to the work that's already been done. As Millie from Millbrae had mentioned, Millbrae and Burlingame both did studies at the same time and came up with pretty similar findings, which I think gives us some confidence. And as she mentioned, the OneShoreline is able to kind of pull the jurisdictions together in a way that we wouldn't ordinarily be able to do just on our own. On the project scale, we are starting to look at a number of new projects on the Bayfront. And I think the examples that Mike Futrell from South San Francisco showed are very instructive in that some of our proposed projects are showing the same types of direction, and that there are resilience actions that can be built into the projects as part of the development. And this is the time to ask for that. It can be everything from the Bay Trail being at the 2100 elevation that it needs to be at, from landscape plans being designed in such a way that they can also provide flood protection and resilience, making sure the buildings are at the right elevation so that they can withstand some flood events should it come to that. Each project is then kind of stitching into a bigger picture, and then the big picture is where I think OneShoreline can help with a more encompassing project. But it may be, we've got some great opportunities. Some of these projects have significant portions of the shoreline, and if we can get jump started with landscape design that they would be doing in any case, but have it designed in such a way that it matches the longer term plans that we've been looking at, then I think we're that much further ahead.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, and my experience in working with the potential developers and property owners on the Bayfront is that, of course, they want to protect their assets, and they are willing to invest in this infrastructure, but they want a fairly definitive answer as to what the standards are going to be. So it's been incredibly helpful to have Mr. Matterman, Supervisor Pine, Director Gardner sitting at the table and providing a framework from which these folks can understand what the expectations are going to be. And then it really takes a lot of the onus out of the public hands in terms of having to pay for this very costly infrastructure if we can time it all in at the beginning. And given that we upzoned some of the land on the front of the bay, recently we created a lot of value for the property owners. And so that value has, the council has felt very strongly that that value creation should also benefit the public, and that asking for them to pay for and sponsor some of these improvements is appropriate, given the change in the value of the assets that they're holding.
Okay, thank you. We have a technical question, kind of technical. So we've been talking somewhat about construction projects in some of these areas as improvements. Where construction is planned, are there seismic and hydraulic studies that verify with margin to determine that the land will not sink below the expected FEMA relevant levels? Specifically, this person is pointing at, the famous San Francisco luxury tower that currently is sinking due to land shifting.
I can
So-
speak to that for South San Francisco, and the answer is absolutely yes. What a lesson the Millennial Tower in San Francisco was. So for all of our developments, and I know the ones in our neighboring Brisbane, they pound hundreds of foundation posts all the way down to bedrock. So the answer is yes. There's a lot of work being done there. Unfortunately, it was a lesson for Centennial Tower, but it's our Millennial Tower, but it's one that we have learned.
Okay.
And I'll add, Kathy,
Yeah.
in the construction of levees, there are federal requirements for them to be certified by the Corps of Engineers and to get FEMA certification, so people are outside of the flood zone. There are requirements in our area that the geotechnical engineers need to look at whether they could withstand a certain magnitude earthquake, a certain distance from the levee. And it's a pretty, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's a pretty substantial earthquake. I think it might be an 8.0 within a certain geographic area. So I think it's just safe to say that this is a consideration that all of us working on the shoreline need to take into account, and we do.
Okay, that's good to know. There's a couple of funding questions. People are always interested in the money. Does South San Francisco intend to pursue transportation-related funding for the SPIT project, phase 2 or phase 1?
Possibly. And actually, we've already gotten some seed money from the Transportation Authority to look at the feasibility of water taxi service north-south from the San Francisco ferry terminal straight down to South San Francisco. As you may know, WIDA operates, of course, they're big ferries, but they only go east-west. There is no north-south ferry service, and 40% of the workers in South San Francisco live in San Francisco. As a result of that, WIDA is doing a pilot program for ferry taxi service north-south. So yes, we've already gotten a little bit of that. And the answer is maybe. But the bigger answer is we all need to get creative on how to fund this. I did see some notes in the Q&A about Foster City and Measure P, I think it was. They passed a $90 million special tax for their residents to build their protection, which makes sense since Foster City is by and large an infill city. That may be the answer for all of us at the end of the day. I hope not. I hope that we are creative enough to leverage transportation dollars, state dollars, federal dollars, wherever we can to get the job done without burdening our residents any further. But that's the initial goal. We'll see where that lands.
Well, there's a related question to that. So that was a good lead into this question. So is any city organization, lens organization, proposing to add any property taxes to fund these projects? Specifically, this person brings up Measure AA, which taxed every single parcel in 9 counties, but could only be spent on Bayfront. So there was no money for coastside, for instance. So the question is, are there any proposals being floated to increase property taxes to help fund these kinds of mitigation projects?
I'll jump in with a short answer to say, hopefully not in South San Francisco. We are trying to leverage other sources first before we go to that really difficult ballot measure in the future years. But I am concerned and supportive of Supervisor Pine and Lynn Matterman when we look at a permanent funding source for OneShoreline. And I'm not sure where that's going to go, but I'll leave it to the supervisor to perhaps discuss that.
Any other?
Oh, Dave, you're muted.
As was noted earlier, the funding mechanism for OneShoreline is not permanent, and we do need to find a way to fund our day-to-day expenses. And we have been doing some exploration into a possible parcel tax. The Measure AA that was referenced earlier, that's a parcel tax that crosses all 9 counties in the Bay Area that raises money specifically for tidal wetland restoration. So we have been exploring the idea of whether a parcel tax potentially combined with the goal of assisting with fire mitigation efforts might be a fruitful avenue for finding long-term funding for the district.
Okay, thank you. This is a question directed to Doug Yakel, who is the SFO representative. Can you bring us up to date on the current status of the shoreline protection program? How does SFO plan to fit this project with other projects to the north and south of the airport?
Thanks for that question, and thanks for the opportunity to join tonight. There's been a lot of projects that have been put on hold or delayed as a result of the pandemic and the dramatic drop in activity that's happened at SFO. This project is not one of them. This is one of the projects that is moving forward. We feel that it's important to get a plan in place because, as we all know, sea level rise won't wait for our economic recovery. We need to get on it now. Len mentioned earlier that we are in the early stages of environmental permitting. We hope to have a draft environmental impact report available for the public to view by the end of this year. And even prior to the pandemic, our hope was to complete environmental permitting and begin construction in the 2025 timeframe. And essentially it would consist of a series of walls that would bound our 8 miles of shoreline. There are some walls in place right now at SFO, but these are more focused on protecting against tidal action and wave action during storms. It's not sufficient to protect against a 100-year flood or 42 inches of sea level rise, which is what we're designing for. And we've also been in close contact with our partners to the north and south, and we look forward to continuing that collaboration. I think it's important that we do view this holistically. We're all in this together. We need to understand how each of our collective solutions can fit together with one another and leverage for the ultimate goal that we all share.
Okay, thanks. So maybe Len can answer this question, or anyone can pipe up. So the question was, we've been talking about cities here in the North County, but what have other cities done to address sea level rise? Maybe specifically cities in the East Bay, what San Francisco's thinking about, just to give an overall picture of how the Bay Area in general is addressing this problem.
Well, I can say that in this very south part of the county, in East Palo Alto and across the county line in Palo Alto, there was a very large project that does address sea level rise up into the level that I was talking about earlier. So, 4 feet above the FEMA flood zone plus the 2 feet of freeboard, or 10 feet above the high tide. And so that project's been built. It was built in 2018. And then of course, Foster City is under construction. In the other areas, we're in various stages of kind of conceptualizing or planning or design. Of course, it doesn't mean that a lot of areas are seeing water regularly today, although some areas see it during king tides now. But I think most areas are in some level of conversation or early planning. And so if you remember, there was that map that I showed that had all kinds of areas of the Bayside with various colored lines. The objective for us is to figure out how those can be aligned and connected. So for example, Foster City is under construction now. Just to the south of Foster City is Redwood Shores, which has the same issue Foster City had, where FEMA presented them with information that said, you either build something or you're going to be in the flood zone. And so we're working with Redwood City and San Carlos and Belmont and San Mateo County, where the San Carlos Airport is, to develop a project that connects into Foster City just to the north with a similar or maybe greater level of protection. So at various stages around the county. In other parts of the Bay Area, different agencies are certainly thinking about this and working on this. In terms of built project, there's really not much. There is a Corps of Engineers project down called the South Bay Shoreline Project, which is focused now on El Viso. And that project is, I think, just beginning construction or just about to. It's been in the works for about 20 years. So hopefully other projects move more quickly. But that project is now kind of at a pretty mature stage where it can begin construction of protecting that area of El Viso. Otherwise, many agencies like ours are thinking about this and doing some planning. And there are, fortunately, forums for us to be communicating with the other counties, because as you can imagine, where the counties meet, it's critical that we work together so that these projects, not just within the county, but across county lines, are aligned and connected as well.
Is there a formal consortium within the Bay Area of organizations like yours to meet regularly and to cooperate?
Well, there was something called CHARGE, Coastal Hazards Resiliency, something, I can't remember exactly, but it's formed about 10 years ago, actually, quite a long time in terms of kind of sea level rise thinking, but it was focused on sea level rise at the beginning. And that still exists and is the forum that I was talking about, where I get together with colleagues in the other counties. Also BCDC, which is the Bay Conservation Development Commission, has been looking and just announced a program to try to move forward on some sort of collective planning exercise. BCDC has been thinking about this for many, many years. And it is hard to get 9 counties together on a collective approach. It's hard enough to get 1 county together on a collective approach, but to get 9 of them. But BCDC is making the effort, and Supervisor Pine is on the commission, and others in San Mateo County, and are focused on trying to get that done.
Good. I think we've got time for one last question, and it's kind of a scary question. So I think I understand what they're asking. Are there any places in San Mateo County where managed retreat is being considered?
So on the coast side, that's a complicated issue because there are communities that, and the Coastal Commission is a big proponent of where a bluff or a cliff is eroding, that you don't just add concrete to it to harden it, and so that's a real tough thing that communities on the coast side are facing. And in some areas, that may be called for. In some areas, it's not. When I think about managed retreat on the bay side, I think about elevating structures. That's retreating above the floodplain. And so that's how I look at managed retreat on the bay side is we're not going to be moving the developed areas away from the bay. We're going to be protecting them. But can we elevate them so that we're above where the water is? I don't know if Mike wants to add to that.
Just a little bit. On one of my slides said find a solution that works for South San Francisco. We've looked at managed retreat, and unfortunately or not, we're an urban city, industrial city. There's not a lot of opportunities there, except one. I did mention we were building a beach, a sandy beach that we can enjoy as part of a park. Well, effectively, that is managed retreat. It's being managed in a way that you do expect the water to come up on that beach shoreline and creep in there, and that's fine. But otherwise, as Lynn said, we've got billions and billions of infrastructure built out, and we're looking for other solutions. But I think for other cities, it would be a very viable alternative.
And that can be done in a relatively small way in the global kind of countywide sense, but in a significant way locally. When we did this project at the East Palo Alto County line, essentially we was managed retreat because we opened up a creek channel and created a very broad floodplain. So it allowed the water to spill into areas that it couldn't spill before. But at the same time, we protected homes and businesses behind that area. So, as Mike said, they're looking at South City and doing this on a particular beach, and that's great. And we look for opportunities to incorporate natural solutions, managed retreat, if it involves creating new marshes, So there are opportunities to do those kinds of things, but to say that that's a kind of a broad objective of the county at this point, that's not where we're at.
Okay, good to know. All right, thank you everyone for your consideration of these questions and your answers. I'm going to turn this over to Margaret to finish up our successful forum here. It's been very, very interesting.
Thank you, Kathy. Please join me in thanking the following people who made tonight's presentation possible. Dave Pine, San Mateo County Supervisor and OneShoreline Board Chair. Donna Colson, Burlingame City Council Member and OneShoreline Board Member. Len Matterman, CEO of OneShoreline. Mike Futrell, City Manager of the City of South San Francisco. Kathy Wheeler of the League of Women Voters of the North and Central San Mateo County, who facilitated our Q&A time. And in addition, I would like, in addition to our presenters, I'd like to thank Kevin Gardner from the City of Burlingame, Craig Sentis, Andrew Yang, and Millicent Cowley Crawford from the City of Millbrae, and Doug Yakel from San Francisco International Airport for their availability to answer our questions. Please join us for the final forum in this series on October 14th at 7 p.m. It will focus on the impacts of climate change on the Pacific coastline of San Mateo County. If you'd like to view tonight's presentation again or share it with others, it will be available for you to view in both English and Spanish and Mandarin on YouTube. If you like the education you've gotten here tonight and you'd like to be a part of offering programs like these in our community, we invite you to join the League of Women Voters. We're a fun bunch, we're active, and we are always happy to welcome more of our fellow county residents to join our mission of empowering voters and defending democracy. Just visit our website at League of Women Voters, North and Central San Mateo County. That's LWV and CSMC. Finally, if questions come to mind that you wish you'd asked, send them to oneshoreline.org/LWV-forums. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Good night.